Hello everyone, today we talk about the Hebrew infantryman of the 11th century BC. There's nothing overwhelmingly specific about this military historical unit. However, for the sake of completion and passing in fact through some of the most average generic units that may be difficult in fact to adequately characterize for the sake of such in fact military historical inquiry, they're actually very important to deal with, right? The Jewish Bronze Age is quite fascinating, given that a lot of biblical events basically take place in these times and places. I made just a few videos about Jewish history and in particular Jewish warfare. If anything, it's something that we're probably going to cover much more in the future, both for ancient and also contemporary warfare for that matter. One specific element here that immediately stands out from a historical point of view is the scarcity of surviving images of Hebrew warriors. All right. There literally isn't, for different reasons, not just the Jewish anachronism, but also some general sort of vetusty. But for the general age, quite a long time ago, in this case, at the end of the second millennium BC, and in a land that at large was relatively homogeneous in a material terms with the neighboring ones. At some point we have here already quite strong, powerful hegemonic empires at the outskirts of the Hebrew lands, except this is also the peak age, like of at least David, and quite a lot of warfare that the Jews were undertaking at that point. Again, this doesn't quite matter in the sense that we have relatively few evidence from other cultures. Here it's difficult to sort of as well. Here, of course, we get even less than that. It happens to find, by the way, a lot of, foreign depiction as opposed to self-representation. Sometimes think about the sea peoples in the Egyptian iconography as opposed to the same sea people. Of course, we can reconstruct in different ways through also their original lands. In any case, we have to deduce the appearance of the Hebrew infantryman, so the average, as we'll see now, essentially spearman, as you can imagine, / javeliner, from the time, from evidence collected from surrounding cultures as well. In order, by the way, to cope with this, from a graphic point of view, on Schwerpunkt, I redo ad triarios. I use AI, but not the lame one. At least the pictures, in a sense, may be lame, as they may not be particularly detailed, etc. But they are pretty accurate. I never use content that fundamentally does not fit the exact prototype that you may have seen, in fact, on the battlefields in that era. AI, again, the free commercial type you can find in very few sites, because most of them you have to pay. But I must say that if you, again, give, and that's where my work comes into play, you give them sort of an original prompt with, of course, the most important thing is actually the drawing per se that I create on the base of models. Don't ask me how or why. I resort to this because I was even a good drawer, at least up to my teenage. Then, easier access to the internet came, and so I somehow took off on another level, the one of the same history, and the one would also bring me here, telling the truth. But I find this acceptable because if the skeleton here, the sketch, is faithful, and this is original, this is really, I drew it myself, and that's essentially what the AI is going to build upon. Like, this is actually pretty good content, right? Pretty good compromise between historicity and whatever sort of weird stuff such sites can allow you to do, in a sense. But again, I deem it satisfiable given that, especially my content has never been about. I use telling the truth really lots of beautiful images normally, as you can see from the rest of my content. So stuff that is pertinent to, of course, like the subjects at hand. But this is exactly what I mean also here. I can't I don't have the time for making too many of these pictures that at the end of the day are also going to look the same, because the prompt, basically, you know how these sites work basically. You give them this prompt and they add a slight variation, and you just play this sort of roulette where you eventually pick the best result, right? Then you can give it a touch of brush or something. But again, I'm satisfied with the results, and I've often used this because finding good, like, sort of free, let's say, Creative Commons commercially expandable pictures is very difficult. That's why you see all the Wikimedia Commons credits in the end, because Wikimedia Commons has become the only place where I can find such relatively free imagery, meaning that it's all licensed on Wikimedia. It's maybe not completely 100% the case that the image taken is actually licensed in many ways, but again, fair use is also a pretty solid thing, and it never really had any problem. But I care very much. Other channels do something much more equilibristic, copyright-wise, on Schwerpunkt. We're really well defended. And this is my original pictures. I'm really proud of that. Of the Hebrew infantryman of the 11th century BC. All right. So this figure came out as an effort to recreate the attire and gear of. Now we'll start using all a set of Hebrew words. They are basically also the standard word, as you will see here. It's more like a linguistic inquiry than any kind of strictly military historical one, because how do you think Hebrew infantrymen of this era differed from any other infantrymen in Levant in practice? Of course, there would have been some characteristic things, but here we mostly read the Bible and other sources. This guy would be an hayil, that in Hebrew means, for ancient Hebrew, because these terms also change over time, as you know, in slightly, it's, if anything, from a semantical point of view, in the way they're properly used. Hayil stands for valiant man, right? So here we're looking technically, as you understand here, the equipment is quite Spartan, quite primitive, right? There isn't anything really that stands out in particular. But already, for these forces to have, as you can see here, a metal helmet, a fairly sizable shield, a spear. Could have made also a larger shield, because there were of this kind, but I also tended to stick a bit to the average heavy infantryman, so to say, right? So the final rank heavy infantry guy, as opposed to also lots of skirmishers that would have not really looked that different from him, and that yet we can, in fact, distinguish in their tactical employment, depending. This could be the same exact guy fighting in different circumstances, as assault infantry, as line infantry, depending on the situation, as a skirmisher. All right. So the Hebrew word hayil comes from the root hayil, which conveys strength, power, or capability. And this root appears in other Semitic languages like Akkadian and Ugaritic, where similar terms denote strength or military might. In the Hebrew Bible, hayil means strength, valor, wealth, or even an army itself, right, the host, depending on context. For example, the Bible describes a mighty man of valor like Gideon in Judges 6:12, or a capable, even woman of valor in general. So these are also instances outside of the military context, where in Proverbs 31:10, hayil can refer to material wealth or a military force, as in the case of the Pharaoh's army, like described in Exodus 14:4. The word's versatility naturally ties physical, moral, and material strength, according to traditional universal belief, together with the Hebrew worldview of the time. In later Hebrew, it's used decline instead, but it persists in the modern one in forms like hayil. So you understand the assonance, which in fact stands for soldier, reflecting military strength. Related terms from the same root include kil, which means pain, travail, so somebody who's struggling, right? Remember the concept of sacred royalty, he who eternally rises as the king of the living, and kol, which means weakness as well as such. So something deriving from at least the outcome of an effort, however. Another terminology that we could attach to this infantryman, other than hayil, is ish bahur. The Hebrew phrase ish bahur translates to young man or chosen man. So this is exemplificative of the pastoral war bands the Israelites had stemmed from, and that fundamentally indicate the usual practice of picking the best, at least of the youth, right, to sort of send out to loot and pillage in these war bands that were therefore constituted by someone who has to be made, and that came to, like in other cultures, to equate actually to some, over time, to some professional trooper, as de facto professional trooper as time progressed. We've seen it also in other peoples, that fundamentally the war band, think about the zip and the comitatus historically, right? The latter was just originally sending this youth out to become like the actual men of the zip at large, that lived in a more heavenly celestial dimension in origin. But later on, the zip becomes ever more agricultural, whereas the war bands become ever more, in fact, professional and specialized, and actually also dictating rule under the greatest leaders. This is important because the timeline that we pick here overlaps, as we've seen, with the reigns of Saul and David. So we're approximately, respectively, 1025, 1006, and the following 1006, 968 BC, regardless of all the sort of historical, philological issues we're not, of course, going to go over now. But this phrase, ish bahur, carries specific connotations in biblical as well as in classical Hebrew. Its etymology and meaning derive from the combination of two words, ish and bahur, of course. Here's an explanation of what they mean. So ish comes from the Hebrew root, in fact, ish, or a related Semitic word meaning man or person. It denotes an adult male, often emphasizing individuality or humanity. Perhaps we'll make a bit about the rise and fall of the ancient Jewish civilization, as I've done also with other peoples, both of them in the European background. And ish is a common term across Semitic languages like Akkadian, like Avilum and Ugaritic. In the Hebrew Bible, ish is used broadly to mean man, husband, or person, depending on context, as in every man, for example, literally defining rank in this case. This was from Exodus 12:16. There is, however, a higher meaning, which is obviously connected with that sort of golden dawn of these warriors, namely man of God. All right, this is in 1 Kings 13:1. The word bahur instead, deriving from the root bahur, meaning to choose or to select. So it's a bit in, say, the Semitic equivalent to the Roman legion, right? The idea of to collect, right, which comes from a pretty also foundational Indo-European etymology. We'll probably start soon something more about those topics as well. You understand how this reflects some picked forces of some sort, retinues as well. And so again, everything overlaps because we can't see at a sort of basic freeman, husband, farmer, etc., that goes out there to fight, or someone who is more closely related to the retinue of a specific leader of a war band, right? So as we've seen, this root choice of bahur implies something choice, select, or distinguished. In the Bible, bahur refers to a young man, however, because these were in fact the ones selected to be sort of sent out, right, to fight, as in other cultures, often implying vigor, eligibility or suitability, fitness, of course, psychophysically, as in a warrior or also marriageable man. So basically, this is a term that indicates manhood as far as the springly, juvenile, virginal sense of power renovation. It's the same concept of the mutton, for example, a bit like in the Alexandrian tradition of the horned individual. And we'll talk about that more because there are very interesting interconnections with all these cultures. Isa Haya 62.5 indicates bahur describing a young man marrying, for example. The term suggests youth and potential, sometimes with a sense of being chosen, right, for a role or quality. Thus, together, Ish bahur in biblical Hebrew describes a young man of prime age, often vigorous and notable, as seen in contexts like Jeremiah 31:13, where it refers to young men rejoicing. The phrase emphasizes both the individuality of man and his youthful choice status. The later Hebrew, bahur, retains its sense of a young man. In modern Hebrew, it's still used to mean young man or youth, though the full phrase ish bahur is less common, with bahur, in fact, alone sufficing, because, of course, like contemporary societies do not think just much in terms of Bronze Age war bands, but still, we are technically similar, and just, if anything, we will have to explain it better at some point. And so the phrase's significance ultimately lies in its depiction of youthful strength and potential, often tied to social martial roles in ancient Israelite culture. Passing to this guy's equipment, well, it really reflects a blend of Canaanite and Philistine styles that were naturally quite prominent, influential, and close to the same Hebrews, as we were saying before. So we can't think that, again, there were radical divides. You see in the picture a shield known as magen, which stands for shield but also protector, right? It's interesting in its etymology, carries both literal and metaphorical significance in biblical and classical Hebrew, right? As opposed to something more material, for example, like hoplon, right? It also indicates a broader sense of technical panoply, even though, of course, the origins were also in there a bit more elevated. The etymology of magen traces to the root gun. I don't know how to read that, but it conveys the idea of protection, covering, or defense. This root appears, of course, also in other Semitic languages, such as Akkadian, where we have maganu, meaning to shield or to protect, and is related to concepts of safeguarding or enclosing. In the Hebrew Bible, magen primarily denotes a physical shield used in battle, symbolizing defense against attacks, as in Psalm 3:33, where God is metaphorically called a shield himself for protection. So apotropaically speaking, that's a hell of a theological reference. We could expand on it, but if anything, this for sort of more in-depth data. The magen also extends to other figurative meanings representing divine protection or a defender, such as in Genesis 15:1, where God tells Abraham, "I am your shield." Once again, this is notorious, and that's also present in the literal translation in the English Bible. The term emphasizes security and safety, often tied to God's role as a protector in Israelite theology. In later Hebrew, magen retained its meaning as shield and appears in phrases like magen David, shield of David, the star of David, symbolizing protection and Jewish identity. And it was also a broader universal symbol telling the truth, but we'll talk about it in other terms. In modern Hebrew, magen is still used for shield in both literal, for example, military context, and symbolic senses, such as in the name of Israel's emergency medical service, among the others. In fact, Magen David Adom. This shield you see here again is slightly, perhaps, again, we don't have the broader standards of the year. Of course, we can't sort of guess that shields were not enormous, but they don't have really to be effective. They can be even relatively light. The important in a general warfare is still dominated by war chariots, and therefore also a hell of a lot of archery, both from them and also from the infantry. And given the fact that the Hebrews were not particularly affluent at this point, at least they established a significant power, but of course we're talking the times, the places of still relatively primitive societies. Of course, there wasn't an overwhelming amount of armor around, and therefore the final rank, or also picked, as we've seen, trooper here, would have not really necessarily been distinguished just by particularly high level of armor. This is completely normal for the era, right? What we've seen it even going back in the further millennia, that even, having a helmet was to be a very heavy infantryman, in the 3rd millennium BC, right? So this differs. But against arrows, right, shields are pretty effective, and given the pretty intense hail of projectiles, also, by the way, in Hebrew warfare itself, because there was a lot of guerrilla and a lot of, in fact, also what today would be properly called asymmetric way of coping with bigger powers like Egypt, more organized hosts to begin with, would be quite helpful, right? Given that here we're talking about heavy infantrymen, tendentially this would be the guys that have the larger types of shields, and most of that was basically like due to hand-to-hand combat necessities, but also a lot of projectiles pairing, because as you know, combat lasted a few minutes at a time, and this could go on intermittently for even an entire day, right? For not more, depending which kind of circumstance you find yourself in, also in siege warfare, etc. And therefore, the time in between was used mostly skirmishing. Then you have a thrusting spear. So you see this guy is pretty heavily oriented, pretty hand-to-hand combat kind of. Even though, again, the absence of armor in the model, in this case, tells us that, like a bit in the Middle Ages, commoners with cheaper armor tendentially wanted to use pole armors, like things that could keep the enemy at a certain distance, exactly because they couldn't afford sort of to come to closer grips with him, like knights, right? That, for example, used a lot of chopping weapons because they were well defended, and against them, for example, the type of weapon was not particularly effective. Now, the thrusting spear is called Roma, spelled R-O-M-A-H, which stands for, it's very generic, telling the truth, this is the case for most vocabularies, the difference, between spear and lance, right? The semantics is often overlapping with the sense of a spear that can't be thrown at a point. Lance, of course, comes from the Latin, the received through French and English vocabulary that entails exactly the thrown etymology. That's the difference, right? But literally the same spear can be a javelin or vice versa, especially in contexts like this. Again, this is the heavy infantryman, so tendentially they may have had themselves some javelin with them, but tendentially here you see what kind of massive spear he has. For this kind of fight, he would preferentially go just for anything that functionalized hand-to-hand combat. There would have been other skirmishers around. We will deal with them at some point. But he also multitasks, he can do different things at a time. In biblical and classical Hebrew, Roma refers to a weapon in general, right? Its etymology is less clear in this language than some other Hebrew terms, as it lacks a widely attested Semitic root in related languages as well. And its likely root, which I will avoid to pronounce because I would get it wrong anyway, may be connected, it's very similar to Roma itself, in fact, be connected to the idea of piercing or thrusting, though this root is not well documented outside Hebrew. In the Bible, Roma appears in military contexts, denoting a spear as a primary offensive weapon, often paired with a shield or sword, like in Numbers 25:7, where Phinehas uses a Roma to kill. It signifies a long-pointed weapon used for thrusting or throwing, typical of ancient Israelite and Near Eastern warfare as well, the most universal weapon among sedentaries in particular. The term is relatively specific and less common than other weapon-related words like, as we'll see now, so sword. Actually, here we see there would have been a side weapon. Here it's not shown. I tried to do it, but the AI wouldn't properly show. It's as if it were part of the belt, like a dagger, right? Sword would be herev. The bow would be keshet, if you're interested in various terminology. And in later Hebrew, including the Mishnaic and medieval periods, Rama continued to mean spear. However, apparently less frequently used as warfare terminology evolved. And of course, Hebrews were also under the influence of many other cultures in the meanwhile. So in modern Hebrew, the Rama is still recognized as spear or lance. In any case, it's a largely archaic term, or at least it's used in historical, literary contexts. When the modern military terminology, even for, again, such relatively old weaponry, favors other words even. All right. Then you have a bronze helmet that you can see with that shape that is also similar to, in fact, lots of other shield of the ear, almost a Montefortino kind of, not really progenitor nearly, because how many ways are there to make a helmet, telling you the truth, of this lighter or economical type. The term in Hebrew is koba, often transliterated without, because it would be Kobha, right? So it can be transliterated without the H and with the K. The Q before the K instead of the K. In biblical context, it refers to a helmet or head covering in general, used as protective gear in warfare. I like how the AI here, actually I drew it myself in the original model, but creates some kind of headgear, some sort of padding that would have been worn underneath the helmet. For ancient warfare, we have actually scars, hints at the fact that this kind of organic armor was fairly spread, right? We don't see it very much in the art of the era, but there's also a lot of a bit of heroization, a bit of symbolism connected properly to the metals, to other elements of the equipment. This does not mean, of course, this is not the answer to why we see a few of that. Apparently, there was really fewer compared to medieval times, but it's only on the basis of what we can see iconographically. Then, of course, also archaeologically, materially, organic stuff deteriorates. So we have a relatively few amounts of that for the Middle Ages, at least to the extent that we would like to understand better. The etymology of koba is tied to the root koba, which generally relates to covering, fixing, or setting in place, though the root's use for helmet is specific to this now. The root appears in related Semitic languages such as Akkadian, where similar terms denote covering or protection, but direct cognates for helmet are less clear. In the Hebrew Bible, koba is used to describe a military helmet, as in 1 Samuel 17:5, where Goliath wears a koba of bronze on his head. And so what you see here, of course, is something relatively similar. It's given that here we're talking about sort of fairly affluent warriors by Hebrew standards as well. The idea is that peoples like the Philistines, that were essentially basically Mycenaeans, were Europeans, were sort of better placed, better put in a way, as they functionalized most, especially the ones arriving up to Israel into war banning, and this, as we've seen, pretty far-ranging expedition. I made a video about the sea peoples a couple of months ago. We'll come back on them. We'll see all the equipment of this era. The term koba is relatively rare, but highlights the importance of head protection in battle, of course, alongside other gear like shields or spears, which would be the basic panoply, as you understand, for a well-armed warrior at the time. In later Hebrew, such as Mishnaic or medieval texts, koba remains associated with helmets, but it's less common. As again, also here the vocabulary gradually changed. In modern Hebrew, koba is archaic as well, with kasa being the standard term for helmet instead. The word's core meaning revolves around safeguarding the head, and so maintaining the same root sense, rather covering or fixing. When you look at the shield here, first of all, we decided to represent this particular shape, which is pretty universal, especially extending some cover, at least in a more, sometimes depending on the size, on a more individual kind of fighting, meaning skirmishers would prevalently have, tendentially have smaller round shields. There were also kind of rectangular shields. This is something we'll see better for the, as you know, the Persian army, for example, as it would come developing from also the Assyrian period. So we'll get to that at some point. There were lots of designs we've seen, if anything, iconographically in other videos that were rectangular, but not necessarily larger. There would have been different types of this kind, also larger. Here I simply decided just to use the oval one, which was, however, the most typical, apparently. Round or oval, so to confer this mostly individual protection, because the rectangular and tendentially flatter shield is better suited for creating shield walls of some sort. The Hebrews had pretty good hosts, but aside from the fact that they were generally speaking more enacting more hit and run tactics, there was still also some pastoral warrior ethos to their background. So here we should always take in consideration the presence of cavalry or chariotry, at least. This is the period, as we've seen also in other videos, where cavalry is embryonally developing next to chariotry. Pretty much everywhere, but still not as a fully fledged arm that would become so essentially by in like 300 years or something, which is very important to understand. So the point is that the Hebrews would scarcely have the capacity to withstand massive war chariot-based armies, even though they had their own war chariots, because they came from these highlands, right, the interland, gradually attacking other peoples like the Canaanians, for example, whose warfare we have looked at. We've seen even Canaan chariotry and Hebrew and Egyptian countermeasures for that matter. The Canaanians were good at chariotry, and in general, if you want to withstand them, here is also a moment where, as you know, towards the end of the Bronze Age, where infantries would get tougher, and as we know also for the clash between David and Goliath, in some sense, we're really in this period. There were lots of tough infantrymen coming from Europe that would put an end, the sea peoples, broadly speaking, to the hegemony of war chariotry. So this is a transitional phase where, of course, in Jewish armies you could find, aside from the fact that they also fought against one another, of course, a capacity to form, it's difficult to say orderly, linear formations. These things did exist, but they fought mostly in some more scattered, clanic fashion. We really have to wait the Assyrians to have something really more sort of battle line oriented in some more strategically standardized fashion. Hence also the reason why the more round or oval, slightly concave shield, because that was more functional to individual fighters, even though they always fought in formation that had the greater proclivity, rather forming shield walls that would have been ineffective against the most powerful mounted forces. And these guys were better off sort of skirmishing, being a bit more flexible, with tendentially open ranks, also in rocking themselves on some promontory, etc., and ambushing and so on. That's the vibe you should get from this. Again, we will make other videos about other Jewish warriors types. Here we look at something fairly basic as well, but mostly towards the heavier end of the spectrum. Right. Of course, the Jews had chariots, etc. But they had, at some point, in less consistent fashion. And infantry, in this sense, was more important in their warfare. For the rest, again, there was an important similarity. The shield was often constructed from wood covered with leather, like as you can see here in the effect of the AI texture that I prompted. It could also be made of bronze. I mean, of course, the ultra-elite of the Jewish military was pretty darn well equipped, and they would be quite living up to the terminology of the Bronze Age. I mean, these are tendentially also starting to be the times of the Dentar panoplies in much more heavily armored context, as you know, in Europe. But, of course, those who fought on chariots at this point had become ever heavier, etc. So the Jews had this stuff as well. But they could fight, of course, on foot, and often charioteers themselves dismounted. This type of shield, by the way, were sort of connected findings at Megiddo and Lachish, where similar, in fact, weapons were used. In that case, by Canaanite forces, they were found and connected in the evidence to them. But again, pretty much the same, very close people to one another. The Rama, so as we've seen, at least in this case, a long, heavy spear with a bronze or iron tip, was designed for close combat thrusting, as seen in depictions at least of Philistine warriors on the Medinet Abu reliefs from Egypt, dating to the 12th century BC, so we are here. The Kaaba was a normally conical bronze helmet, as far as we represented it here as well, occasionally fitted with cheek guards, which, again, aligns with the universal kind of helmet of different millennia at this point, as found in warrior tombs at Tel El Farasot, reflecting Philistine metallurgical influence as well. As we were explaining before, there is all a history of military development coming also from Europe. At this time, we will see this because I created a video about exactly this topic, and also the magical connections with that. Of course, the Middle East had quite of this, but the more advanced, or at least the more militaristically focused cultures, especially of the Indo-Europeans at this point, were coming to pound hard also the Levant, as the same biblical stories recount, and the aforementioned struggle between David and Goliath. Besides, we have, speaking of David, in the biblical references, an elite group known as the king's mighty men, in particular David. So here we're looking at the picked elite force, retinue of the king of Israel. The term specifically is gibborim, the plural form of gibbor, meaning literally mighty men, heroes or warriors, in biblical as well as in classical Hebrew. It derives from the root gbr, which conveys strength, power, dominance. These were really it's a bit like saying the paladins of Charlemagne in that vision, and including the holy anointing here that was a thing, as you know, in the Jewish, like in the Germanic tradition. This word appears in other Semitic languages, such as Akkadian. Gabaru, for example, is connected to gibborim, meaning strong or powerful, and Aramaic as well, emphasizing might or heroism. This is what considered like semi-mythical figures as far as they went, with a particular blood and closer to the divinity. In the Hebrew Bible, gibborim refers to strong, valiant men, often warriors or leaders distinguished for their courage and prowess, as in 2 Samuel 23:8, where David's elite fighters are called gibborim, which is, again, the reference here. It can also denote as a term powerful figures more broadly. For example, in Genesis 6:4, the gibborim are mightily men of renown, possibly with, especially at that point in the chronology, ever more mythological but in this sense, closer to divine connotations. The term emphasizes physical strength, martial skill, or exceptional status, often tied to military leadership roles in ancient Israelite society. In later Hebrew, including Mishnaic and medieval texts, gibborim retained its sense of heroic or mighty figures, but became less common in everyday use. And in modern Hebrew, gibbor, singular, is used for hero or champion, which also well describes, in the latter case as well, the truly elite, but properly military, technical nature of these warriors, while gibborim appears in literary or historical context to evoke, if anything, biblical warriors or legendary figures. So it's a bit literally our concept of hero, champion, and so on, which at the time would have been literally out there. The Bronze Age is the age where, in the battlefields of the Mediterranean, you could still encounter people who were demigods by traditional understanding. And these kind of gibborim, mighty men in David's guard, may have well also worn a scale or lamellar corselet, known in Hebrew as shirion. We've partly seen the sort of tactical complement to such elite troops, namely being charioteers. All right, so these men, again, also in David's guard, were eligible for this. And the type of armor we just described was typical, for example, of the Huri, the Mitanni elite. We're looking at a sort of medium-length bronze corselet with a belt. The helmets were being pretty consistent, bronze variety, also illustrated in the Egyptian sources, as at least for the Huri, the Mitannians, having a blue-painted reinforcing rib on the crown, to which was attached a red textile or horsehair crest. This military cultures were much more sort of Indo-Europeanly vibrant, so to say. The Hebrew word shirion means armor, straightforwardly, even coat of mail later on. And technically, let's not digress on this topic as well, but in biblical and classical Hebrew, it referred to the general protective gear worn in battle. The etymology is uncertain. It likely derives, however, from a Semitic root or y, or a related form, possibly connected to the idea of covering, binding, or protection. While direct cognates in other Semitic languages like Akkadian or Ugaritic are not well attested, similar terms for armor exist, suggesting a shared concept of defensive equipment. In the Hebrew Bible, shirion typically describes body armor, often made of metal scales or plates, as in 1 Samuel 17:5, where Goliath himself, in fact, wears a shirion of bronze. And so, as we were talking about before, so those were tendentially the heavier peoples compared to the Jews, as we will see, were significantly lighter on average than this ultra-elite force, representing there the champion itself, right? Also in those, Goliath is that. Shirion signifies a warrior's protective covering essential for combat in ancient Near Eastern warfare, and is sometimes paired with other gear like a helmet or shield. The term underscores the importance of defense in military contexts. In later Hebrew, such as Mishnaic or medieval texts, shirion continued to mean armor, but became less common. And in modern Hebrew, it's really the same, but often used in historical literary context. Right. The other word is, for example, for tank, like the actual modern tanks, misharayon, reflecting armored vehicles in modern warfare, is literally deriving etymologically in the Hebrew vocabulary from the Bronze Age armor. This is, again, quite fascinating. By the way, these guys, especially the charioteers, would have had the smaller types of shield, paradoxically, because they were so well armored that they didn't need the larger shield of the kind. But in fact, we can imagine this elite forces of the Israelites having a pretty comparable equipment. You need a smaller shield, not just because of protection, but because you're jumping off the chariot in combat back and forth. You you're already well protected. You're making a hell of a physical effort under that armor, and so everything was calibrated to degrees that we can only measure in psychophysical terms. These were real champions, real heroes, as the etymology suggests. These corselets, as we explained, were made essentially of small bronze plates sewn onto leather structure that were excavated at sites like Bet Shemesh, indicating their use by elite warriors in the region, so pertaining to the Israelites as well. However, the military historical unit that we have pictured here is far lighter and sort of more widespread. Right, the former tends towards the ultra elite, the utmost elite. By contrast, most of Israel's militiamen here were far less heavily equipped, typically wielding a javelin as well. Here we don't see it. This would be known as anith, or a sling, by the way, which is much more, of course, Davidian in vibe. So the Hebrew word hanith means, in fact, both spear and javelin. Like, there is a greater tendency toward the latter. I explained many times how, of course, there are more specialized design towards sort of the more thrusting, heavy, stopping, you can argue, spear, and sort of the lighter weapon that can be sort of more effectively thrown. There are different types of weights, as you know, so we're not entering too much in the depth because, again, the evidence is relatively scarce to make anything more comprehensive. We can see mostly, as I explained in some videos, something about the protopelum in Romano-Italic warfare, and again, things that are pretty unshocking, meaning that these weapons were pretty much universal. And again, there could be more or less sort of characteristic weapons of this kind that may, of course, suggest, given the slight differences, some inclination of the type of warfare towards a direction or another, but fundamentally we're talking the same weapon. The etymology of anith is tied to the word which likely relates to piercing or striking, though direct cognates in other Semitic languages like Akkadian or Ugaritic are not well documented. The root suggests an action of penetrating or engaging in battle, by the way, which connects with other words. In the Hebrew Bible, we find it connected to the spear associated with warriors, like in 1 Samuel 17:7, where Goliath's spear is described as massive with a shaft like a weaver's beam. And this, again, is what I was telling about before, the fact that we're in the presence of some sort of heavy javelin, which also, in fact, especially from a Jewish perspective, fighting against the Philistines, would appear bigger, right? And for reasons we'll see better when we study this waves of foreigners. It appears as a term in military context, emphasizing the weapon's role in close combat, or as a thrown projectile distinct from other weapons like the sword or bow. And of course, the term highlights the spears and / javelin prominence in ancient Israelite and Near Eastern warfare. We find, again, pretty much like the same trend in later Hebrew, like the term is there, but it's less frequent. And in fact, it's still essentially an archaic and historical term, right, as the others we've seen before. This link, of course, was there, and here, however, we're really entering the field of the lightest types of troops that are not heavy infantrymen, like in this case instead. And again, it's not like these guys could not or would not use these weapons. On the contrary, they could be very, very active in performing with that. But of course, if they could afford a heavier gear, of course, they would preferably go to war with that, and within the context of some sort of more structurally organized host. The hanith, as a light throwing spear, at least in this case, with a bronze or flint head, was commonly found in Iron Age 1 assemblages at Hazor, while slings made of woven flax or leather were attested by cases of rounded sling stones at Philistine sites like Ashkelon. So it's a really interesting picture, and you understand how much this area sort of overlap in military culture, material military culture in particular. The gear of such warriors, of course, was in the bigger picture in a state of continuous development, even though, again, the changes to our sort of contemporary pace technological eye are incredibly slow, right? Bradypic almost. But, of course, this was actually a time of great change. It was basically the end of the so-called Bronze Age. And again, I made some videos at this point about Bronze Age warfare, explaining a bit, something even as far as niche as this one, but we haven't fully pictured at times the actual transitional phases. I haven't even really planned to start like a basic manualistic history Bronze Age series of some kind. And again, I should do it for literally every era and every context. It starts becoming a bit complex, and it sort of dilutes the military content that at times is really necessary, like in this case, and I want to be known chiefly for that. But of course, it's important to look at the bigger picture too, and it can't be just left to some random military details aspect, right? So overall, we test the pulse of such military pace as well. We explained today how even a guy, pretty lightly kept for, I don't know, maybe the second half, or maybe I'd say the end of the first millennium BC standards at this point was something relatively heavy in general, as infantry development in particular was yet to sort of strengthen in the way we know for the later era, to the point that still by the late antiquity we can speak of infantry as the queen of battles. It hadn't been the point up to this point, all right? Or at least there had been an infantry prevalence at some point, but mounted warfare had become a big deal in the previous millennium. And so, again, we're gradually documenting this, and I'm really glad, especially making these videos. We have archaeological, let's say, consider, of course, we're looking at different peoples that mutually, reciprocally influence one another. I personally am of the idea that you can't speak of military, especially material culture, merely as the product of the mechanical passage from a people to another. There are some arms and armor types that distinctively develop in different regions more or less at the same time. While you cannot say that this was fully interdependent, because the entire world was actually interconnected at this point. This is something we tend to underestimate to a huge degree, but this is in fact the point. You can have an idea spreading, but also just a practical need existing at the same point. So from one side, it's impossible to think that such solutions wouldn't be pretty much found instantly, especially the simpler, the more primitive the technology was. Also, you can't think that there isn't a mutual interconnection between all these peoples, which especially, again, since especially the spread of the Indo-Europeans and that pretty colossal wave of military expansion and technological development, right, was at this point like really tying together the entire, like the extremities of Eurasia in quite important fashion. And at a smaller scale, for example, we see archaeological evidence from Gezer showing that trade with coastal Philistine cities introduced iron weapons such as daggers and spearheads into Israelite arsenals by the late 11th century BC, supplementing locally produced bronze armaments, which is part also of a greater development at the same time of warfare with cheaper elements. We were talking about it just the other day regarding what it means to have more power, but with which actual means. Like material ones are not per se the ones through which you can reenact some higher level of spiritual awareness, also as far as holy war is concerned. So this is more philosophical topic, but it does tie into the changes of the eras from the bronze to the iron as a form of decadence, not actually of improvement. This is rather something that we'll have to talk better about another time. Nevertheless, this was more or less the picture we wanted to draw. It's relevant, of course, that even with relatively few information, you can sort of almost feel the consistency of these warriors' sort of tactical role, general political and social background, etc. As far as I'm concerned, like the most important thing is to find to be complete about this continent, to find especially all the better means to provide with more of it through such, for example, AI art, which is completely fine. And again, we've made, especially in the last year or so, pretty darn good Bronze Age warfare content. Doesn't get uploaded too soon. Actually, I started this very early on. I don't remember whether I stopped. Perhaps I think at some point I did stop. But we have, with this video, the 31st Bronze Age Warfare 1. So you can always check out the playlist. You know that Schwerpunkt does things quite tidily, and we get to naturally browse everything that we do through different playlists that can really help also improving your choices. Like if you like, for example, Bronze Age Warfare, of course you will find the greater amount of the mixed content, also different peoples at the same time. If you're more interested in Jewish history and warfare, you have another playlist. So far, I have here a Jewish history playlist. We didn't talk about the Jews so much, telling the truth. Jewish history, 10 videos, yes, because especially this year we made that mini-series about especially the Jewish revolt. And so that came handy. We talk about other things, not too much about the Bronze Age era, so this video actually does come up pretty well, let's say, in the broader picture. I'm glad about this. We're going to surely expand on this and the broader. I have to create stuff more for, I don't know, for Egyptian warfare, we have it already. Right, we could, for example, starting to divide between New, Middle, Old Kingdom back in time. Ancient Egyptian warfare, so few, only 9 videos. Well, anyway, should make more, because overall Egyptian warfare 23, but this last, well, okay, we'll see how to do so, because there is really a lot to do actually about that. But for example, we don't have a Mesopotamian warfare playlist, and we should absolutely get some of it as well. I don't remember what I wanted to look at now, but again, it's unfortunate. It's just the era a bit, like Bronze Age warfare covers a bit, sort of a broad array of topics that sometimes one day I have some extra time and make new playlists. I created recently something about Germano-Slavic warfare. I created something about the Grand Duchy of Tuscany, history of theology, medieval European warfare, which I never really conceptualized as a whole playlist, but we're gonna do right now, and it's already gotten 11 views, which for a playlist, given the catchy sort of amount of, you never know how the playlists are going to perform. Some are there from years, they get, 20 views, nobody watches them, so you can't even eliminate them. But others, like the simpler ones, but the bigger ones, are also relatively, like you had never thought to really insert them because you had medieval Europe, European warfare. Then we can go more in depth with that if it is really effective as far as getting more views. Critical, it is sharing. I say it every time, and that's obviously the best thing to do. We go step by step. We try to be as effective as we can. And I see there is a decent traffic, right? That even when we make a video with really few views, nobody seems to to notice it. I mean, I don't notice you. You may not watch the certain videos like this History of Mediavistics Part 2. Why didn't you watch that video? I've never received such a low amount of views like in years. And it was actually pretty good stuff. But nevertheless, suddenly sometimes videos that I say, oh, this is just like a half, this is not really so relevant, they explode. And I don't know why, but this is also typical on YouTube. The broader volume of traffic, however, remains at this point pretty much within an important range. And considering that probably we're not making too many views overall, we're not an overwhelmingly notorious channel, etc., things are, after all, not that bad. And we count on escalating further. We are almost at 28,100 subscribers. We rose a bit from last spring in terms of number of subscriptions, but we have to keep up with it because it doesn't sort of fuel itself by itself. And considering that last summer I didn't receive so many views, after all, this is somehow a comforting picture, because it seems that the ranks have really stiffened over time. We're getting lots of people, and most of them I don't really see them in the how do you call it, the comments. And again, it may be just a matter like most people admittedly do not have any particular interest of showing up. But of course, consider that the more you comment, the better it is for the channel. So again, let's do this if we have to. For the rest, today in particular, I stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.